The train wheezed into the station like some old, reluctant beast, brakes shrieking against the rails until the whole platform seemed to hold its breath. Evening light pooled in molten streaks along the tracks, and the wind, dry and scented faintly of creosote, worried the hem of Evelyn Carter's dress. She stepped down, clutching a worn burlap sack to her chest as though it contained the last fragile piece of her. A pair of children paused in their game to stare. A man in a dusted hat muttered something to his companion. The words carried just enough to let her know she had been recognized before she even spoke. The sound of her own name, whispered like it was sharp enough to cut, floated past. Somewhere in those murmurs was the story. The girl who had shamed her family. The bride who had spurned Harlan Pike at the supper table. The Eastern-bred beauty who had handed back a promise in front of a room full of witnesses. She could still see Harlan's face, turning that particular shade of rage that has no place to go but into a man's pride. And she could still hear her mother's hissed warning, "You've cost us everything, Evelyn." She walked with her chin lifted, though every step felt like the town itself was watching to see if she would flinch. The sack dug into her arms. It was not heavy in weight, only in meaning, and she had not dared to open it since the day she left. She had been put on this train under the pretense of starting over, though the truth was simpler. They wanted her gone before the shame spread any further. She had not gone 20 yards along the street when the air ahead seemed to thicken. Harlan Pike stood before her, flanked by the long afternoon shadows of the awnings. He had grown fuller since she last saw him, the fine waistcoat now straining at the buttons, but his eyes were still the same, small, cold, quick to appraise and dismiss. "Well," he said, loud enough for the passers-by to pause, "if it isn't the runaway bride. Come to finish what you started." The sting landed in her chest before she could brace for it. She kept walking, but his voice chased her. "Or are you here to find another fool, to shame?" A ripple of laughter moved through the small cluster of listeners. "Leave her be, Pike." It was said plainly, without heat, but it cut through the jeer like the clean edge of a blade. Evelyn turned to see a tall man leaning against a wagon hitched in the shade, lean and dusted from the road, his hat tipped just enough to shadow his eyes. His hands rested easy at his sides, though something in the stillness of his frame warned he could move quick if he needed to. "Not your concern, McAllister," Harlan replied, but there was a hitch in his tone now. Jedediah McAllister didn't bother answering. He stepped forward, lifted the sack from Evelyn's arms with a quiet gentleness that startled her, and placed it in the wagon bed. "You need a ride?" he asked. For a moment she thought of refusing, pride and fear pushing against each other, but the thought of walking under so many eyes made the choice for her. She climbed into the wagon, settling beside the rough plank seat. Harlan said something behind them, but the rattle of the wheels over dirt swallowed the words. The road out of town stretched into the low hills, where the air smelled of sun-warmed grass and the sound of crickets swelled. Jed drove in silence, and she found herself stealing glances at the scars crossing the knuckles of his hands, at the steady way he guided the reins, at the small lines at the corners of his mouth that looked more like they'd been carved by weather than by laughter. "Don't worry," he said after a long while, eyes still on the road. "No one bothers you on my land." It was not a promise she had asked for, yet landed somewhere deep, like a warm coal in the hollow place inside her. By the time they reached his ranch, the sun was folding itself behind the hills, the sky gone to copper and violet. The house was plain, weathered to a soft gray, the barn a little lean to one side. He led her to the ladder of the loft above the stable. "You can stay here tonight," he said, "safer than the boarding house." She nodded, stepping onto the hay-softened boards. The air was cool, the scent of horses below mingling with clean straw. She set the sack down, but her hands lingered on it, as if afraid it might vanish. He turned to go, but the words rose in her before she could stop them. "Please." Her voice was barely more than breath. "I beg you, take them off." He stopped, puzzled. She knelt, fingers fumbling at the knot until the burlap mouth opened, and then she drew them out. A pair of white bridal shoes, lace-trimmed and spotless despite the miles they had traveled. He froze, his shadow stretching long in the last light from the doorway. "They were for my wedding," she said, eyes on the shoes, not on him. "My mother told me to wear them to remember the duty I owed. I want them gone." Her voice wavered on the last word. "Burn them, please." Jed didn't reach for them right away. When he did, he held them as though they were fragile in some way she had not expected, his thumb brushing a bit of lint from the toe. "Not tonight," he said finally. "You've had enough burned for one day." The kindness in it undid her. The tears came fast, hot, and ungoverned. She turned away, pressing her sleeve to her face, but the sound betrayed her anyway. He set the shoes back in the sack, tied it with the same care he might give a newborn's blanket, and left without another word. She lay in the loft long after the barn fell to stillness, listening to the soft shifting of the horses below. The shoes sat in the sack by the ladder, a weight both terrible and strange, as though they carried every word she had never been allowed to speak. And for the first time since she stepped off that train, Evelyn felt the faint, bewildering sense that someone might see her as something more than her shame. Morning came pale and silver, the mist curling low over the pasture like breath on glass. Evelyn woke to the rustle of hay shifting beneath her and the muted sounds of Jed moving below, the scrape of a pail, the low murmur he used with the horses. She lingered at the loft's edge, watching him work. He moved without waste, each action deliberate, as if nothing in the world could rush him. When he glanced up, catching her watching, there was no embarrassment in his face, only a brief nod, the kind one might give an equal. In the days that followed, she found herself learning the small rhythms of his life. The mornings were for chores, carrying water, hanging laundry that snapped in the wind, gathering eggs still warm from the nest. Jed said little, but his silences were not the heavy kind. They left space for her own thoughts to move without judgment. More than once she returned to the loft to find an extra blanket folded neatly at the foot of her bedding or a tin mug of coffee left steaming on the railing. They were gestures so quiet they might have gone unnoticed had she not been starved for such things. But the town did not forget. When Evelyn ventured in for flour and sewing thread, eyes followed her like the click of beads on a string. Mrs. Pike, wrapped in black silk despite the heat, spoke in a voice pitched just high enough to carry. "A shame, isn't it? Some women don't know when to stop chasing trouble." Laughter clinked around her like glasses being set too hard on a table. Evelyn kept her back straight, but her throat tightened with each step toward the counter. Harlan was waiting outside the general store, leaning against the hitching post with his thumbs hooked in his belt. "Trading down, I see," he said, his gaze sweeping deliberately toward Jed's wagon tied across the street. "McAllister can't afford much, but maybe you've learned not to be so particular." His smile was a thin slice of something rotten. Evelyn didn't answer. She brushed past him, her heart hammering like a fist against the walls of her chest. She avoided Jed's eyes when he met her on the boardwalk. He didn't ask what had been said. Perhaps he already knew. Gossip in a town like this was a current that reached everyone eventually. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. The road stretched long and straight under the blazing sun, the air trembling with heat. That night the wind shifted, bringing clouds from the west. The storm broke fast, a whip of lightning, a sudden downpour that rattled the barn roof. Evelyn ran for the line where she had left the day's washing, but the mud was slick, the air thick with the scent of wet earth. She slipped, her ankle twisting beneath her, and a sharp cry left her before she could stifle it. Jed was there in an instant, lifting her as though she weighed no more than the wet skirts clinging to her. Rain streamed from the brim of his hat onto his shoulders, darkening the fabric. He carried her inside without a word, set her gently on the settee, and knelt to wrap her ankle with a strip of soft cotton torn from an old shirt. The warmth of his hands seeped through her skin, steadying her in a way that frightened her with its unfamiliar comfort. He placed a cup of broth beside her and stepped back, giving her space as though aware she might run if pressed too close. By morning, the ankle ached less, though the air between them held a weight that hadn't been there before, a wordless awareness neither seemed ready to name. Evelyn moved slower that day, mending a strap in the shade while Jed repaired a fence post. The sound of hammer-on wood carried in the still air, each strike a steady heartbeat. Near sundown, the sound of hooves broke the calm. Harlan Pike rode into the yard with two ranch hands trailing like shadows. His voice rang out before he dismounted. "She's stolen from me, McAllister. Took gifts meant for my wife." He said the word wife like it was a brand he could burn into the air. Jed stepped forward, wiping his hands on a rag. "You'd best leave. She's got no claim to be here. And I want what's mine." Harlan's eyes cut toward the loft, and Evelyn felt the prickle of his intention. He meant to climb up there, to drag the sack into daylight for the whole town to see. "You're not going in there," Jed said, his tone unchanged but his stance shifting, weight settled like a man who knew how to hold ground. "Step aside," Harlan warned. Jed didn't move. The ranch hands shifted in their saddles, eyes darting between the two men. The air was tight enough to snap. Evelyn could feel her own pulse in her throat. She climbed down from the loft, the sack in her hands. The moment she touched the ground, she pulled the drawstring loose and withdrew the bridle shoes. Their white had dulled in the dim barn light, but the lace still clung to its delicate pattern, a remnant of what had been expected of her. "They never fit me anyway," she said, her voice steady. Then she walked past both men and dropped them into the churned mud at Harlan's boots. The splash stained them, brown climbing over white like truth over a lie. Harlan's jaw worked, but no words came. The ranch hands looked away, uncomfortable, and after a long beat, he turned back to his horse. The hooves faded into the dusk. Evelyn stood in the yard, her breath visible in the cooling air. Jed watched her, but said nothing, and she was grateful for it. Gratitude was a dangerous thing. It could tether a person faster than rope. The last light of the sun spilled over the hills in long ribbons of gold. She found herself on the porch beside him, the boards warm beneath her bare feet. Somewhere beyond the pasture, a coyote called, a lonely sound, but not without purpose. For the first time since leaving home, Evelyn felt the smallest edge of herself return, the part that had been buried under duty and shame, the part that had dared to say no. She didn't know what would come next, only that the shoes were gone, and with them, the weight of what they'd meant. Inside the barn, the sack lay empty on the loft floor, swaying slightly where she had dropped it. The night wind found its way through the open slats, whispering over the hay as if carrying the beginning of something neither of them yet understood.